Welcome to the 2025, Volume 6, Issue 2, Winter Podcast edition of the Journal of Philosophy of Emotion. Published January 31st, 2025. All contents are protected under the Creative Commons, Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives, 4.0, International Deed. Table of Contents. Editorial. Onishi Brian Hisao. 2025, A Fecund Constellation of Ideas. An Introduction to E-Co-Affectivity Book Symposium, Journal of Philosophy of Emotion, Volume 6, Number 2, pages I to V, URL, https://doi.org/10.3397/2025.winter.0i, Book Symposium, Ole, Marjolein, 2025, Precis, E-Co-Affectivity, Exploring Pathos at Life's Material Interface, Journal of Philosophy of Emotion, Volume 6, Number 2, pages 1 to 5, URL, https://doi.org/10.33497/2025.winter.1. Grosser, Florian, 2025, Affective Communality, Journal of Philosophy of Emotion, Volume 6, Number 2, page 6 to 14, URL, https://doi.org/10.33497/2025.winter.2. Oh, J.A. Sophia, 2025, Hope for a New U.S./Earth via E-Co-Affectivity and Zhang. Journal of Philosophy of Emotion, Volume 6, Number 2, pages 15 to 22, URL, https://doi.org/10.33497/2025.winter.3. Paley, Miguel Jose, 2025, Affectivity, Continuity, and Separation, Journal of Philosophy of Emotion, Volume 6, Number 2, pages 23 to 29, URL, https://doi.org/10.33497/2025.winter.4. Ole, Marjolein, 2025, Replies to Grosser, O. and Paley, Journal of Philosophy of Emotion, Volume 6, Number 2, pages 30 to 40, https://doi.org/10.33497/2025.winter.5. Referee Acknowledgements. Recent Publications Announcement. CFP Announcement. Begin articles.
Article 1. A Fecund Constellation of Ideas. An Introduction to E-Co-Affectivity, Book Symposium by Brian Hisao Onishi. While Marjolein Ole's 2020 book E-Co-Affectivity is clearly rooted in the phenomenological tradition and works to extend the scope of eco-phenomenology, it is also not bound by the tradition. In the opening pages of the book, Ole identifies a desire to move from an anthropocentric phenomenology to one that is grounded in the fecund connections between material junctions and the affective traces folded into the interstices of bodily existence. That is, it seeks to break the disciplinary boundaries of phenomenology and allow for a new direction in phenomenologically driven environmental thought. The goal of this move is to highlight the fecundity at the heart of interfaces that mediates and co-creates effective responses and emerging existences in ever new ways. Ole 2022. Something that is refreshing about Ole's work is that the drive to get back to things themselves is accompanied by the rigorous project of connecting the fleshy sinews of the world. From the generative networks of feather and air to the soil-wide fecundity of placental tissue, Ole's work makes connections between material existences and demonstrates the relationality and co-creativity that drives the emergence of meaning in the concept of eco-affectivity. Ole's move aligns her with phenomenologists who explore the intersection of phenomenology and environmental thought, such as the foundational work of Ted Toadvine and Charles S. Brown's 2003 Eco-Phenomenology, Back to the Earth Itself. Through that volume, eco-phenomenology promoted the idea that we want to be part of the Earth, biotic communities, and abiotic communities. We want to join in a celebration alongside others in a way that is currently hindered by our common projections about how meaning works and how the world shows itself to us. Ultimately, Ole's work brings together the compost communities of Donna Haraway's 2016 staying with the trouble, the intuition of phenomenology, and the magical rationale of Aristotelian middle voice to drive us toward a more robust ecological understanding. By bleeding the lines between narrow disciplinary boundaries, she steers the topic of affectivity away from notions of human emotion or anthropocentrism and pursues an effective materiality where what is active and what is passive seek to meet, but find themselves suspended in an undecidable space and time where effective processes endlessly overlap and withdraw. Olay 2020-30. Her focus on effectivity provides a fuller and deeper insight into the underpinnings of how living beings are always in motion. That is, how they come to be, grow, interact, react, suffer, and die.
Article 2. Precis. E-Co-Affectivity. Exploring Pathos at Life's Material Interface. By Marjolein. Abstract. In this precis I provide a brief overview of my monograph E-Co-Affectivity, which combines biology, phenomenology, ancient Greek thought, new materialisms, environmental philosophy, and effect studies. I briefly outline central concepts such as affectivity, interface, community, and the middle voice. Keywords: affectivity, suffering, biology, science, phenomenology, new materialism, temporality, pathos, dagonet, interface, plants, birds, placenta, skin, soil, ontogenesis. Suffering, compassion, reflection. If any terms capture my life's orientation and its fundamental motivation, these three get at its core. It was devotion to understanding suffering as illness that drove me to my first career, that of medicine. And it was reflection on the meaning of suffering and compassion that led me to my investigations of affectivity. As I use the term affectivity, I use it with the ancient Greek term pathos in mind. This term in Greek has a wide spectrum of meaning, including suffering, feeling, passion, illness, and qualitative change. Reaching, in meaning, from incidental change and emotion to illness and excruciating suffering. The term pathos for the Greeks covers an amazing array, true to the dynamics of life's emergences and transformations. While my earlier work more narrowly focused on the meaning of pathos within the philosophical discipline Olay, 2012a, 2012b, my monograph E-Co-Affectivity, Exploring Pathos at Life's Material Interfaces, Olay 2020, seeks to overcome narrow disciplinary boundaries and aims to steer the topic of affectivity away from notions of human emotion or anthropocentrism. By turning to affectivity, we acquire a fuller and deeper insight into the underpinnings of how living beings are always in motion. That is, how they come to be, grow, interact, react, suffer, and die. This focus is much needed to complement, if not strategically undermine, modern philosophies' focus on static and insular activity, autonomy, and disembodied freedom. With the term E-Co-Affectivity, I seek to emphasize that affectivity neither occurs in a vacuum nor pertains to singular, discrete entities. It implies a certain place or milieu, hence eco as in the Greek oikos, and connection to others, hence co. The hyphenation I use speaks to the fact that the influence of place and community cannot be tightly distinguished from the happenings of affectivity I investigate here. E-Co-Affectivity is one phenomenon. In this book, I integrate readings of natural scientific studies with philosophical reflections on the emergence of embodied life. Inspired by new materialism, ancient and continental thought, and scientific studies, I explore various concrete interfaces where affectivity co-emerges. Nutrition in plants, sensation in bird feathers, the placemaking organ of the placenta, the sentient sapient interface of human skin, and finally the co-constitutive interface of soil. Within that terrain of concrete interfaces, I make an innovative attempt to perform philosophy as it engages the concrete material interfaces and to follow the logic that emerges. For instance, in the case of trauma to bird feathers, I follow recent ornithological research on fault bars in feathers to grasp how avian bodies may reallocate their traumatized feathers, thus showing the responsive capacities prevalent in bird bodies. Admittedly, I play with various terms and figures to indicate what I mean by eco-affective life as it comes about in connection to others and its environment, such as boundary, limit, etc. 1. The preferred term that I work with is interface, given its strategic emphasis on the productive in-between that allows place, time, and being to become. Rather than starting with the subject, extending outward from the inner, the focus is placed on the in-between, the interface. The most fruitful definition of interface I have found is in the work of François Dagenet. Quote, "The interface, as noted from the start, constitutes/proves to be a region of choice. It separates and at the same time mixes the two universes as they meet within, as they generally bleed onto it, interface. As such, the interface in itself becomes fruitful convergence." End quote. Dagenet 1982-49. What I find particularly productive here is the notion of the convergence that in itself allows for the emergence of both internal and external factors. In my focus on the interface, I seek to analyze the concrete materiality of the interface, and in so doing, to provide a situated affective ontology. The benefits of such a situated focus on affective ontologies are many. For one, instead of a generic discourse on affectivity, such an affective ontology can be more flexible and faithful to the uniqueness of each concrete form of affectivity. Secondly, such a situated discourse can concretely show how and where form, abstraction, and choice emerge out of affective materiality, e.g., on the level of the individual, the species, the community, etc. Thirdly, this focus brings to the four aspects of local ontogenesis and spatiotemporal synthesis that crucially inform the work of affective interfaces. Fourthly, in thinking through different categories of affective change, incidental, qualitative, substantial, and aesthetic change, and how they interact and contaminate each other on the local level, this book demonstrates both the need for using such categorical inventions and the need to break them down. In thinking through eco-affectivity, the concept of community is crucially important. I use this term in a broad sense, namely as, quote, life in community with human and non-human others, end quote, Ole, 2014. Plato's and Aristotle's concept, dualization of city-state and community, form a helpful theoretical background to understanding the ontological necessity of a community for the eco-affective formation of individuality. Simultaneously, I contest their ideas for their prioritization of a human community and for ranking community higher than individuals. In my argument, I also reserve a special role for the concept of the middle voice. The middle voice, originally a linguistic category, is particularly suited to grasp eco-affective ontogenesis, given the fact that it goes beyond the dichotomy of a so-called active subject and a passive object, and focuses instead on processes in which beings participate. The middle voice accordingly emphasizes the fact that a subject does not simply act, or is simply a passive recipient to a process, but indicates that a living being is, quote, participating in a process that encompasses the subject, end quote, Ole, 2020-24. I mostly unfold the dynamics of the middle voice in the first chapter, devoted to plant life, but the middle voice is present throughout the entire book, moving through animal life, the life of the placenta, human skin, and finally soil. Finally, a few words on the book's structure. The book begins by focusing on plants, moves on to discuss touch and bird feathers, considers next the ontogenetic boundary, that is the human placenta, and uncovers the meaning of the skin as a sapient and sentient interface crucial to human affectivity. This structure does neither reflect an ontological nor ethical hierarchy. Rather, I seek for the different analyses of affectivity to acquire complexity in their own terms, while potentially also cross-pollinating the other accounts as well. The book ends by examining the interface of soil, and specifically its messy, unrounding, porous, relational character. By turning to soil for the final chapter, I foreclose any avenues that could lead the reader to presume that human sapient affectivity should be prioritized. Instead, this chapter focuses on a material interface that, in its interrelationality, can offer some prescriptive guidelines for an eco-affective ethical regime to come, specifically within the context of anthropogenic climate change. Here I ask for attention to the reduction of an threat to the soil's symbiotic communities, and ask the reader to envision the soil as a place to produce and engineer a new epoch beyond the Anthropocene. The soil's ontogenetic powers and its complex inner workings provide the locale to engage with emergent potentialities and to create more porous and enduring ways to form new communities. Notes: One Ed Casey has done remarkable work with the concept of edge in many of his books, showing for instance in his book The World on Edge that, quote, edges are constitutive not only of what we perceive, but also of what we think and of the places and events in which we are situated, end quote. Casey 2017-13. Please refer to the printed text for references and to cite this article. Next article.
Article 3. Affective Communality by Florian Grosser. Abstract. In E-Co-Affectivity, Marjolein Olay presents a comprehensive philosophical account of pathos, analyzing distinct yet interconnected spheres of affectivity. She persuasively argues that pathic phenomena or experiences underlie and enable the emergence, existence, and individuation of living beings as well as the transformation of communal constellations between them. In my commentary, I first raise questions concerning interpretive and argumentative strategies employed by Olay. Subsequently, I comment on some of the political implications and limitations of Olay's study. In particular, on the underlying assumption that pathos has an equalizing effect on affective communality, and on the resulting relative lack of discussion of unequal degrees and kinds of vulnerability among those who are affected due to differences in social-political status and positionality. Keywords: affectivity, pathos, response, community formation, distribution of vulnerability. Marjolein Olay's 2020 study E-Co-Affectivity, exploring pathos at life's material interfaces, charts distinct, yet interconnected spheres of shared affectivity and of resulting communal constellations in an original and illuminating manner. This commentary will first summarize what it considers to be some of the key achievements of Professor Olay's philosophical analysis of pathos, while more literal translations include suffering, emotion, passion, or incident. I will follow Olay's understanding of the term in the sense of affectivity. Refer to Olay 2024. Subsequently, it will present several clarificatory questions regarding interpretive decisions made and argumentative strategies employed in her book. Finally, critical questions concerning some of its political implications will be raised from the perspective of my own research interests in the political and social philosophy of community formation under conditions of alterity. Correspondingly, what follows primarily focuses on chapters 4 and 5. Against apathy. E-Co-Affectivity demonstrates a remarkable synthetic power as it integrates a broad range of phenomena, from the worlds of plants, animals, and humans, and philosophical approaches from Aristotle's psychology, hylomorphism, and theory of perception to Heidegger's analytic of Dasein, as well as to positions in contemporary new materialism, into a cogent argument that marks affect as irreducible to a merely psychological understanding in terms of emotion, and that establishes pathos with as central to the emergence, existence, and individuation of living beings. The fine-grained descriptions of bird feathers or the human skin are not only based on attentiveness to the phenomena and on a careful engagement with philosophical texts, but also draw on the insights of current research in the natural sciences and thus productively cross disciplinary boundaries. Olay's transdisciplinary considerations avoid a kind of phenomenological thinking that pits itself against science, lend additional support to her argumentation, and also prevent a misreading of E-Co-Affectivity as a merely speculative endeavor. Another virtue of the study consists in her innovative rereadings of Plato, Aristotle, and Heidegger, which repeatedly challenge and correct anthropocentric, essentialist, and static tendencies in the conceptual frameworks within which questions of pathos and of koinonia, association, community, are approached. For instance, Olay's discussions of Heidegger bring out the significance of pathic moments, in particular, of Geworfenheit, thrownness, and Befindlichkeit disposition, or in Hubert Dreyfus's felicitous translation, quote, where you're at Ness, end quote, Dreyfus 1991, 168, as constitutive for his understanding of Dasein. At the same time, she shifts emphasis from the individual to the communal and argues for an enlarged understanding of being with that encompasses the entire living world. In doing so, she stresses the processual, material, communally intertwined emergence of beings rather than concentrating on constancy, permanence, and independence, self-standingness. As is the case in Heidegger's notions of Bodenständigkeit and Selbstständigkeit respectively, as requirements for successful self-appropriation and fulfilled identity. Also, She fleshes out Heidegger's repeatedly schematic relational ontology in detailed descriptions of mediating elements such as, for instance, soil pores. Lastly, she redescribes transgenerational moments of being dash, or rather becoming in the world, not only in terms of a heritage to be repeated or retrieved, but in terms of traumas to be worked through. Olay's rejection of the notion of earth, which is substituted by soil as an ungrounded ground. Judith Butler speaks of precarious or contingent foundations, refer to Butler 2015, especially 119. For community out of effect seems to be shorthand for her critical repositioning of Heidegger's phenomenological thinking. What is at stake in such rereadings is more than exegetically matters, since Olay strives to disclose new conceptual resources adequate to the task of designating the ever-shifting, ever-fragile unfolding of effective communality. Comprising of terms such as middle voice, pregnant city, or fault bars that are of both descriptive and metaphorical power, the vocabulary thus developed undermines sharp dichotomies between subject and object, activity and passivity, and interiority and exteriority. It allows for an improved, phenomenally fitting articulation of corporeally or more broadly, materially anchored pathic responsive forms of agency that are largely beyond the purview of modern and contemporary debates on subjectivity or individual and collective intentionality in theory of action, social ontology, and other areas of philosophical inquiry. Moreover, this vocabulary, in connecting and thereby reconfiguring the semantics of oikos, household, koinonia, and pathos, questions predominant conceptions of what constitutes a community, against the common assumption that genuine, i.e. cohesive and durable communities are predicated on substantial similarities or commonalities between their members. Olay demonstrates how communal existence, habitation, and interaction are not only initiated but continually shaped by multiform occurrences of being affected, i.e., of materially experiencing dash, undergoing dash, and suffering with, which, quote, do not stop at the boundaries of an individual psyche, end quote. Waldenfels 2015, 190, my translation. In these considerations on what could be called uncommon communality, the political dimension of E-Co-Affectivity is most obvious. In showing how being co-affected or suffering with others can institute and sustain communal relations, and not only across lines of interpersonal and intercultural difference, but between species, Olay displays traditional models of community. Instead of short-circuiting community with contraction, Plato and Aristotle's understanding of full political membership qua citizenship, or Heidegger's considerations on modes of primordial belonging as Hin and Zuhorn, i.e. as belonging to and belonging together, are cases in point. She insists on the importance of contact for the transformation of communities. With an eye to today's debates in political philosophy, it seems that her criticism of conceptions of communities as largely self-enclosed, impermeable, and exclusive associations applies as much to communitarian thought as it does to strands of weak cosmopolitan contractarian. And considering Olay's reflections, this term can now be heard in a different register, theorizing in liberalism, putting discussions on speciesism and on politico-moral obligations regarding the preservation of biodiversity and the protection of animal rights on a new, phenomenologically informed footing. She thus confronts us with the apathic constitution of our own personal and societal forms of life. Toward a new U.S., a set of clarifying questions concerns interpretive strategies that inform the treatment of Aristotle and Heidegger's works in E-Co-Affectivity. While Olay's general point about the necessity of decentrifying anthropos, Olay 2020, 150, is crucial and elaborated with great care, her remarks on the realization of new e-communities, which appears to remain a primarily human task, are less clear. Returning to the, quote, double event of pathos and response, end quote, Waldenfels 2015, 20, my translation. At the heart of community formation with a focus on potential human contributions to such a realization, I suggest that significant resources to better understand pathic moments can be found in Heidegger, while Aristotle provides important insights for a more precise grasp of responsive moments. In her book and elsewhere, refer to Olay, 2012. Olay concentrates on Heidegger's considerations on pathos in his lecture courses on Aristotle's physics and rhetoric and on Befindlichkeit in being and time. with that embodied forms of being affected or being moved, and a situatedness within a relational context, an embeddedness in a world that precedes sovereign willing and choosing are marked as integral to Dacian's individuation. However, inscribed in Heidegger's early writings are tendencies that run counter to the project of developing a post-metaphysical conception of subjectivity. To give a rough indication, such tendencies become evident in notions like resoluteness, which, in the context of Heidegger's subsequent problematic politicization or ideologization, culminate in an embrace of a will to self through and with which a collective subject, the people, immunizes itself to come into its own. I would therefore submit that writings from later phases of Heidegger's work offer additional and possibly more productive insights for a reconception of both subjectivity and intersubjectivity. For instance, in his interpretation of Friedrich Hölderlin's poem Remembrance, or in the essay The Thing. For instance, the phenomenal and conceptual analyses of Betroffenheit in the sense of being hit and being struck, of Geschick, not in the sense of a fate, but of ascending that addresses and elicits answers, or of Ding, as that by which mortals are be-dinged, be-thinged, or conditioned, in opening up and displacing individual Dacian, as well as being with, stress their pathic background, emergence, and constitution, and, therefore, transport a more unequivocal recognition of what might be. Designated as extrasubjectivity. Following Roberto Esposito's investigations, one may also wonder whether the way in which Heidegger relates thing and no thing could help to further substantiate that the grounding condition of communality is one of, quote, a common non-belonging, end quote, Esposito 2010, 139, and perhaps also lend additional support to the reflections on the mediating, generative capacities of intervals and interstices. While Ole masterfully draws on Aristotle's De Anima and De Partibus Animalium to reject dualistic understandings of subject and world, her discussion of the in-between phenomenon of aesthetic experience is especially insightful in this regard, and to mark affectivity as an essential enabling condition for all forms of living community, an equally sustained engagement with some of his. There can be no doubt that Aristotle's anthropocentrism is to be rejected and that his list of virtues must be revised. For instance, we might add to it mindfulness of attunement to, or respect for all that is living, to allow for a redescription of the phronimos as an ecommunal rather than a politico-social virtuoso. Yet, due to the emphasis on the gradual character of profound change, on the centrality of interpersonal contact for the growth of modified habits, and on a responsive, in contrast to a sovereign, freedom to plastically reconstitute ourselves, we might find in Aristotle a promising, subtly revolutionary model that can contribute to addressing some of Ole's questions about the path toward, quote, a new community to be, end quote, Ole 2020, 158. To make these queries about interpretive decisions amount to more than just remarks about omissions, I want to address the issue of modes of agency that are correlated with human affectivity in a more general and direct way. Although Ole's point that the focus of her study is on sympathesis, not sympoesis, that is, on the passive rather than the active dimension of a communal we, is well taken, some further specifications do seem necessary, not only because the importance of forming plural inclusive alliances or of making kin, Donna Haraway, is explicitly invoked, but also because of certain tensions in the terminology used. Such tensions are manifest in the semantic fields of caetera, to fall, on the one hand, and of capere, to take or to seize, on the other, while notions of the incidental and accidental, as that which falls on or that which befalls, strongly connote pathic modes of agency. Notions such as receptivity and participation point towards poetic modes. This is not to deny that Ole's reflections productively break open the binary opposition passive/active. However, her study could gain an additional measure of cogency if demarcations were outlined between these modes, or between phenomena and concepts of reaction and of response, that although related have differing implications and orientations. Might it, for instance, be possible to critically distinguish such modes of non-agency according to the extent to which they are middle-voiced? Might they be mapped on a certain spontaneously emergent, discursively expressed, or institutionally secured prosthetics and structures, or onto the moral vocabulary of trust, recognition, solidarity, and responsibility? Or might their specific constitution be brought out more fully with respect to varying degrees of freedom they allow for? 1. A last clarificatory question has to do with the status of and strategy behind the argument for an encompassing pathos with. It appears as if Olay's considerations on new forms of communality out of affectivity play out on a descriptive and, albeit to a lesser extent, also on a prescriptive level. Against the background of broader issues regarding the normative status of phenomenology, the question arises how normatively charged and binding affective communality is meant to be in eco-affectivity. The sustained emphasis on ontogenesis and plasticity mitigates tendencies to normatively ground such communality in physis, nature. Yet it might have been helpful to qualify appeals to natural beings and natural place in greater detail and to explicitly problematize Aristotelian implications of e.g., an allegedly natural hierarchical order of the oikos, household, as subordinate to the polis, city-state. On a related note, it is not evident if, how, and what kind of normativity can be deduced from phenomena like soil pores or behavior patterns like allopreening that occur in the natural world. For instance, the claim that soil can, quote, point the way toward solidarity with other beings, toward unexpected assemblages and gatherings, end quote, Olay 2020, 162, and ultimately to a quote, new us, end quote, Olay 2020, 154, is not invulnerable to objections regarding the is-ought fallacy. Inflictions of pathos, politico-historical limits of affective communality. A set of interrelated critical questions concerns issues of the scope or radius of a performatively realized us beyond the Anthropocene. Olay 2020, 139, the differential distribution of pathic experiences within it, and of its constitution, i.e., its mechanisms of inclusion/exclusion. Attempts to link political community to affectivity have been faced with considerable problems. Political theorists like Nancy Fraser have argued that such a linking by means of the so-called all-affected principle is neither desirable nor workable since ultimately everyone is affected by everything in one way or another. As a consequence of what is sometimes referred to as the butterfly effect, they hold, it is impossible to determine who is to be considered a community member with corresponding claims to rights, participation, or voice, refer to Fraser 2008. I am, however, less interested in such structural considerations than in specific problems of applying Olay's model of affective community transformation to our contemporary moment. Against the assumption of pathos as an equalizing phenomenon that seems to underlie her account, it is important to recognize that social political status and positionality essentially determined by what and to what degree individuals, groups, or on a global level, societies are affected. This differential distribution of being affected and vulnerable and, conversely, of capacities for self-protection, although often veiled behind ideological slogans like "We're in this together," has become abundantly clear during the ongoing pandemic. It is also playing out under conditions of climate change where it manifests itself in vastly differing degrees of exposure to, e.g., rising seawater levels or temperatures and their effects on, broadly speaking, life prospects. It is therefore critical to differentiate along the lines of race, gender, class, and age between strong and weak affectivity, between resulting unevenly scaled strong or weak communal bonds, and between the non-uniform responses given in concrete instances of we-building. 2. As Audre Lorde reminds us, it is not only the expectation that affectivity, qua universal phenomenon, will lead to an equally universal communality that is unwarranted. She also insists on the limits and pitfalls of intersectional conceptions of with-ness and we-ness that remain insensitive to the unique, incomparable character of experiences of vulnerability. Refer to Lorde 2007, especially 114 to 123, to 3. In addition to examining its varying degrees, it is also necessary to further investigate kinds of affectivity, in particular with regard to matters of social justice. If we pay attention to the sources of that which affects, from aphasia literally to due to, individuals and groups, we do not only find horizontal constellations, that is, or supersubjective phenomena, such as natural and technological disasters or somewhat anonymous sendings, like what Olay calls the Capitolocene, Olay 2020, 149. Instead, we also find vectorial, that is, intersubjective and social constellations of pathos. In this latter case, pathos and often pathos as suffering, is inflicted by some on others in direct interactions, as well as through discursive and institutional structures. The manifold expressions of individual, collective, and systemic anti-Black racism in the United States and Europe are cases in point. That affectivity is not always adequately grasped as a background condition of individual and communal life that simply occurs and persists, is demonstrated in Christina Sharp's In the Wake. In a historical and political concretization of the well-established phenomenological topos of embodied situatedness in environments or worlds, Sharp spells out what this means for Black life, quote, "In the wake of slavery, in spaces where we were never meant to survive, or have been punished for surviving and for daring to claim or make spaces of something like freedom," end quote. Sharp 2016, 130. In a weather or total climate that is anti-Black. Sharp 2016, 21. On this basis, she rejects notions of encompassing community that threaten to relativize, neglect, ignore, or invalidate transgenerational experiences of being affected by that weather. For her, we formations that respond to this unique pathos through wake work, as well as an ethics of care and an ethics of seeing, essentially unfold in the mode of the one by one and in alliances among those who are most evidently co-affected. Refer to Sharp 2016, especially 130 to 134. This implies that in-group orientation and auto-solidarity take precedence over out-group relations and hetero-solidarity. It also implies that mutuality, of trust and recognition, cannot be expected, let alone required, since it is over-demanding, psychologically and otherwise, for all those who have lived and are still living under the material conditions of the ship and the hold. Refer to Sharp 2016. Considering this quote, materially sedimented past which continues to weigh on all. Ways of being, end quote, Slavey 2020, 173, skepticism and active resistance to being absorbed into a new communal we are not only likely to occur but also justified. What complements an ethics of care in between those who are tangibly co-affected might well be attitudes, comportments, and practices of antagonism toward those who are not similarly affected, let alone those who are implicated in or directly responsible for the inflicted pathos of violent discrimination, oppression, and exploitation. If we follow Frantz Fanon, 1963, such antagonism is legitimate and, more importantly, of existential significance. As Fanon poignantly shows in his openly revolutionary anti-colonial writings, the experience of exercising power over and using force against their oppressors contributes to finding ways out of zones of non-being and constitutes an almost cathartic, subjectivity repair mechanism for the previously colonized. Refer to Fanon 1963, 39-95. None of this is to deny that Olay's reflections on co-affectivity present a crucial challenge to the sovereignty paradigm that determines much of the modern and contemporary philosophical discourse on political community. In fact, her work is central for developing a cogent critique of, as well as conceptual alternatives to, the models of contractual consent, freedom of association, and self-determination that are all too often deployed in the service of a democratic right to exclude. Neither is it to suggest that Olay is unaware of the material conditions and political, social, aesthetic, and other regimes in place that perpetuate and thrive on division, exclusion, and injustice. This is apparent in her remarks on the urgent necessity of, quote, a new skin politics, end quote. Olay 2020, 133. Yet, it must be acknowledged that encompassing even global effective communality cannot immediately spring from perceptions and experiences of exposure and vulnerability, of loss and threat. Instead, what does spring from affectivity is a multiverse of heterogeneous, locally and temporally circumscribed communities of varying scope with hardly commensurable pathic experiences and, consequently, with vastly differing responsive techniques, orientations, and priorities. Whether common experiential ground and revolutionary purpose can be found under conditions of such plural communality remains an open question. If it is the case, it is only conceivable as a temporally extended emergence mediated by practices of translation or, as Merleau-Ponty suggests in his reflections on the formation of a collective revolutionary subject, as some molecular process that, independent of the choices of free subjects and irreducible to fate, slowly lets existential projects merge. refer to Merleau-Ponty 2005, especially 515 to 518. Notes. 1. To be sure, this is a responsive rather than sovereign freedom. That is, a freedom that does not rest on having control over whereby one is affected, but on the creative repertoire of how to cope with being affected. To on Waldenfels' account, what is required are nuanced distinctions between degrees of we-building that go along with the transition from interpassion to interattention, and, finally, to interaction, refer to Waldenfels 2015-94. 3. Accordingly, Lord emphasizes the importance of deliberately and strategically building alliances to relate across difference and within equality. Refer to Lord 2007, 122 to 123. Please refer to the printed text for references and to cite this article. Next article.
Article 4. Hope for a New Us/Earth via E-Co-Affectivity in Zhang by J. Sophia. Abstract. In E-Co-Affectivity, Marjolein explores the deep connectivity and relational entanglements of plants, animals, humans, and the soil as elemental components of a co-affective community. Her deconstructive reading of the Aristotelian conception of degrees of three souls, with such hierarchy of humans, animals, vegetables, via what she calls categorical contamination, is a brilliant example of how rereading the Western canon can cast important interpretive light upon contemporary ethico-political questions. Ole's work shows how it is crucial to foreground eco-feminist reinterpretations of the writings of major figures in the Western philosophical traditions. It is reconstruction and construction of feminist hermeneutics, so that it is not a mere interpretation, but a transformation of old traditions into planetary cosmocentric new becomings. Through my reading of E-Co-Affectivity, I focus on the coherence of the crucial themes of the middle voice, precarity, and eco-affectivity from my comparative eco-feminist perspective. The Korean concept of Jong, which can be a healing mechanism in the midst of our planetary crises, I will suggest, resonates profoundly with eco-affectivity. Keywords: eco-affectivity, affect theory, middle voice, precarity, nature, pandemic, Dao Lucy Rigore, Judith Butler, Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, Alfred North Whitehead, planetary solidarity, healing, New Us/Earth, and Jong, emotions or feelings. In Eco-Affectivity, Marjolein 2020, explores the deep connectivity and relational entanglements of plants, animals, humans, and the soil as elemental components of a co-affective community. Beyond any anthropocentric approaches to the ecosystem that views more than human nature as part of a conceptual background environment in which human beings are at the center, Ole's holistic approach sees this entangled living system as so many symbiotic organisms. Such a broadly encompassing philosophical horizon expands our ethical concern to cosmopolitan planetary becomings, or eco-cosmopolitan subjectivity, together with all elements as interconnected parts of the web of life. Her deconstructive reading of the Aristotelian conception of degrees of three kinds of souls, with a humans, animals, vegetables hierarchy, via what she calls categorical contamination, is a brilliant example of how rereading the Western canon can cast important interpretive light upon contemporary ethico-political questions. She writes, "The conceptual turn I make in this work to Aristotle not only functions to structure my engagement with contemporary questions, but also serves to add to the study of Aristotle and Plato, namely by showing their relevance and how contemporary questions can uncover forgotten or new aspects to their accounts." 13. Likewise, Ole's work shows how it is crucial to foreground eco-feminist reinterpretations of the writings of major figures in the Western philosophical traditions, including the Bible, for Asian traditions as well. Furthermore, it is a reconstruction and construction of feminist hermeneutics that is not a mere interpretation, but a transformation of old traditions into planetary cosmocentric new becomings. Through my reading of Eco-Affectivity, I focus on the coherence of the crucial themes of the middle voice, precarity, and eco-affectivity from my comparative eco-feminist perspective. The Korean concept of Jong, emotions or feelings, which can be a healing mechanism in the midst of our planetary crises, I will suggest, resonates profoundly with eco-affectivity. Listening to the middle voice, nature's returning and becoming. It is brilliant that Olay introduces the middle voice as a tool to deconstruct binary hierarchies among species and to discover the potentials for activism, agency, or the subjectivity of all. This interdependency of an interspecies relationality is indeed our actual living condition in our cohabitated planet, shared with other humans, plants, and a myriad of living and non-living organisms. From an anthropocentric view, one might see plants as mere passive objects or aggressive and territorial subjects. Olay, however, argues that the grammatical function of the middle voice can help us break free from understanding plants as passive beings, dependent on the outside world, or as overtly active beings, e.g., constantly in the photosynthetic process. Additionally, this view can help us understand vegetative affectivity. In her view, a plant is neither the agent nor the patient, but a coherent and continuous part of a process. 20. The middle voice allows us to grasp plant life from the perspective of a dynamic happening, or in continuous, effective unfolding process. Olay begins her section, The Middle Voice, ch1, with Luce Irigary's quote from In the Beginning. She was, quote, an anonymous world formed by someone's also leads to the passivity of each one in relation to effects coming from the outside, and does not allow the experience expressed by the middle voice, which requires us to pass from the outside to the inside of the self. Irigare 2013, 160, end quote. 21. Irigary's discovery of self-affection through the middle voice also works to enter into a genuine relation with sexual others. Irigary's application of the middle voice helps women to recognize their own subjectivity, beyond the masculine gender-based idea of subjectivity that represents an existing symbolic order of patriarchy. Beyond the subjectivity of human sexuality, Irigare emphasizes that it is crucial to recognize life in non-human living beings, which appropriate kinds of logoi, the inner essences of things in Greek, quite differently. Such recognition is invaluable for the process of becoming human, because it involves respect for the singular logoi of plants and animals. In Through Vegetal Being, Two Philosophical Perspectives, 2016, Irigare acknowledges plant life as a key element for our planetary coexistence with others. If we apply Irigare's auto-affection to plant-human connections, Irigare 2016, 206, one could easily romanticize plants as mere beautiful landscapes or passive assistants for humans. Irigare suggests a mindful distance in the face of a birch, and to the question of how to touch such a vegetal being, she responds, quote, by accepting not to grasp but to be touched by the sight of a birch, end quote. Irigare 2016, 51. Perhaps, from the perspective of a plant, auto-rejection would be a strategy to protect themselves, as we can find a good example from Mimosa pudica, Touch Me Not, in their sensitivities of responding to touch and other stimulation by rapidly closing their leaves and drooping. Olay embraces the two extremes of and finds a hybrid middle voice in terms of this vulnerable connectivity of all, in which plants are not merely passive or aggressive, but also defensive and independent. In this regard, what humans need is to be humble and step back from ownership or stewardship of nature, as another name for the humble plant is the touch me not. On the matter of nature's continuous process of unfolding and enfolding, I would like to suggest nature's self-othering, rather than self-affection, as a negative golden rule of cohabitation. Acting through non-action is called wu-wei. In the Tao Te Ching, Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu 1985, which is the very nature of nature, siren. While self-so-ing is the positive sense of nature, siren, the negative sense of siren might be self-othering as wu-wei, active passivity or doing non-doing. The positive side of this negative aspect of non-doing is yielding, letting nature do what nature does, similar to Spinoza's Natura Naturans. In this aspect, nature as self-so-ing, siren, means at the same time self-othering in the self-negating process of nature. Nature's self-othering keeps creating all kinds of betweenness by its ever-spawning signs in the dynamics of differentiation and resonance. Olay gives an example of plants affected by viruses or bacteria. When affected by these factors, plants will produce special odors to communicate potential harm to other parts of the same plant or other plants. A point I found specifically interesting was that most research denies that plants can feel pain. But this is simply due to our understanding of the word pain. While plants do not have a nervous system, current research is looking at new ways in which plants respond and defend themselves from predators. This research is providing a new perspective on affectivity in plants that is not based on human interpretations of pain. Do plants feel pain? Well, most people would answer no or uncertain, since we are not a plant. Do plants think? Do they perceive if thinking can include cognition? But that does not always include thinking. Plants can sense the world, cognize what to do with what they sense, and act appropriately on this information. I suggest that this is a form of thinking without cognition. Unlike animals with brains, there is no separate system that directs the other processes in this kind of organism. The plant is very much like what the Buddhist term describes as khandhas, aggregates that work together, but never coalesce into permanence. Their growth and communications are rhizomatic and unpredictable. Plants indeed do sense their surroundings and communicate with them through the process of evolution and involution. Plants are becoming together with us. Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari write, quote, "Becoming is a rhizome, not a classificatory or genealogical tree. Becoming is certainly not imitating or identifying with something. Becoming is a verb with a consistency all its own. It does not reduce to or lead back to appearing, being, equaling, or producing." End quote. 1987, 239. This irreducible and irreversible autonomy and difference of each becoming resonates with Irigary's nostalgia for a return to our own selves in this mode of the middle voice. In terms of returning or the return, the Deleuzian becoming is not an evolution but involution, which is creative through the process of chaosmosis, or spatiotemporal in-betweenness. 238. The middle voice in the Greek grammar denotes that the subject is both an agent of an action and somehow concerned with the action. When it comes to nature's process, nature is proceeding and returning like the circulation of air, spatiality, and seasons, temporality. As the Tao Te Ching teaches, quote, "Returning is the motion of the Tao. Yielding is the way of the Tao." Lao Tzu, approximate 400 B 1985-85. In returning to the process of nature, although plants and trees seem to only grow and die, like humans, trees endlessly circulate throughout the involutionary life process of returning, which is not linear or chronological, but eventual kairos, the right or critical moment in Greek, of all via the absolute possibility and contingency of becoming together. We tend to anthropomorphize suffering and attach such things as empathy, etc. to it. If all creatures are at least anoetically conscious, the process of identification, analysis, and reaction/action are a result of threat or opportunity. In both threat and opportunity, there is a common thread. The pandemic exposes a global vulnerability, as the term pandemic comes from the Greek words pan, all plus demos, people, equals pandemos equals all the people. The COVID-19 pandemic has affected the people. The COVID-19 pandemic has affected all of the people on this planet. Everyone is vulnerable to the virus because everyone is vulnerable to viral infection from surfaces or other human beings without establishing immunity. Indeed, our vulnerability is another name for our interdependency. Confronting the breathlessness of COVID-19, would Buddha say that all life suffers, dukkha, due to the fragility and mortality of human life by nature? The Indian concept dukkha is about the nature of life that innately includes the unpleasant, suffering, pain, sorrow, distress, and grief that embodies diverse aspects of unpleasant human experiences, as opposed to the word sukha, meaning happiness, and comfort that embodies diverse aspects of pleasant human experiences. The term dukkha means both pain and suffering since they are mechanically inseparable. Nature's suffering is my pain, and my suffering is nature's pain. That is, the physical and/or spiritual and/or moral well-being of individual human beings is tied to and benefited by the well-being of non-human and non-animal others, even including elemental others of fire, mineral, soil, and water. In other words, to do violence and cause suffering to any other is to do violence and cause suffering to one's becoming or selving process. Linguistics seems to be a perpetual problem in our understanding and descriptions of plant life. A specific example would be our understanding of how we feel pain versus how plants feel pain. Language can be limiting while also granting too much power. As Karen Barrett points out, everything, even materiality, is turned into a matter of language or some form of political and cultural representation. Barrett 2007, 133. Could this human linguistic interpretation of non-human sufferings, in a way, contribute to anthropocentric mindsets, since humans always strive to understand concepts by pertaining them to another? Affect theory is relevant to the development of environmental ethics. In his book Religious Affects, Animality, Evolution and Power, 2015, Donovan O. Schaefer describes affect theory as it applies to humans as that which, quote, sees bodies moving through worlds under the pressure of a complex welter of affects, with language weaving between and reshaping those pressures only sometimes, and even then, only haltingly and unevenly. Affect theory, examining the mobile materiality of the body, thematizes the ways that the world prompts us to move before the interventions of language, end quote. Schaefer 2015-9. The idea is that prior to thinking and speaking, the human organism moves through the world guided by a complex set of intelligent feelings and emotions that direct action and behavior. He seems to be saying that, even with the intervention of language, thought, and reason, our perception of the facts of the world, and the judgments we make to act in the world, are still primarily determinants of our effect. Since the judgments that we make and the actions that we choose have moral relevance to our treatment of non-human others, the importance for environmental ethics is clear. To the degree that affect is a driver of those judgments, closer attention to affect is warranted. There is validity in Ole's argument that animals possess an affective life, though it may not be just as we conceive of it, given our fixed perspectives as human beings. Ascribing feelings of sadness, suffering, or fear to animals, as we experience those emotions, may or may not be accurate, but we can't know. The closest we can come to conceptualizing animal affect is, as she says, a kind of, quote, responsive power of living beings to react to what happens to them, end quote. Ole 2025. Nevertheless, one might argue that given animal affectivity, there exists the possibility that their experience of the world entails the same complex welter of effects. Schaefer 2015-9. Similar to our set of responsive emotions. Given this possibility, we should afford them the same ethical deference that we give to those of our kind, other humans. The kinship that arises with this understanding of the affective life of animals should, therefore, move us closer to a more sustainable and relational ethics toward animals. The problem with that argument is that in total the human species have not been particularly reliable in extending ethical deference to those of our kind. Ole relates her skin theory to Frantz Fanon's critique of epidermalization of black skin, to inferiorize and objectify, so as to create shame, self-contempt, and nausea on the part of the racialized subject. Ole 2020, 131. Regarding the origination of the pandemic, humans have blamed it on wild animals, such as bats, and at the same time, animalized Asian people by calling the COVID-19 the China virus or China disease. In a similar vein of marginalization, the sufferings of black and brown bodies are closely related to the phenomena of environmental racism. The COVID-19 pandemic has magnified already existing racial inequalities and other forms of injustices, and black communities across the country have been the hardest hit by the pandemic. Moreover, Black Americans are overrepresented in frontline essential workforces, and therefore face increased risk of exposure, and long-standing disparities in wealth and income mean that Black Americans are more likely to need to continue working rather than practice safe social distancing at home. How could we overcome the fear and anxiety and the PTSD from numerous deaths from the pandemic and from the result of state violence, perpetuating racial injustices nationally and worldwide? Since the Atlanta spa shooting, the dehumanizing of Asian women has suddenly become a more urgent socio-political issue in the mainstream media. Nonetheless, the shootings speak to a prejudice that is deeply ingrained and largely unacknowledged in the U.S. It is a byproduct of white supremacy, And from the same mentality of anti-Blackness that is the blueprint for all racism, Asian American women in the U.S. feel more vulnerable to go out in the street and raise their voices for their own human rights since the COVID-19 pandemic. Could we think of affect theory in relation to these intersectional sufferings and pains, along with interspecies interconnectedness? Ecological theory has traditionally emphasized equilibrial community states and the development of a criteria for exclusion and indefinite persistence. Nonetheless, ecological theories have developed separately in the subdisciplines of plant and animal ecology. Affect theory meshing with animalism can provide an excellent framework to a less anthropocentric world, or it could justify our ruining of the environment even more. If one were to accept animalism with a point of view from outside themselves, then the world would be linked even more together, as the realization that we are not exceptional would set in. We need more work in this regard, and if affect theory is valid, then this work should be focused on strengthening the more beneficial kinds of human affects, selected out of a complex welter of emotional experience. Judith Butler, 2012, in an article entitled Precarious Life, Vulnerability, and the Ethics of Cohabitation, explains an ethics of precarity and proximity. She writes, quote, "I hope to address here ethical obligations that are global in character, and that emerge both at a distance and within relations of proximity," end quote. Butler, 2012, 134. What Butler is up to here is explaining that we can have ethical obligations that extend across the globe, and that we are responsible for things that go on within relations of proximity or intimate closeness, but we also have obligations to distant regions of ethical space. Vulnerability is not just the condition of being potentially harmed by another. It names the porous and interdependent character of our bodily and social lives. Butler's argument is that we cohabitate the earth with all humans, near and far, and therefore our ethical obligations are global in nature. We share the earth with animals, so it would follow that we also have an obligation not only to animals, but also to the earth itself. Such precariousness is an ontological condition for all life, and situates our ethical politics around a recognition of mutual vulnerability and interdependency. With our fellow creatures, we humans all suffer and are undone in grief and mourning. As Butler addresses in Precarious Life, such that the recognition of suffering and grief in others allows us to feel a shared social vulnerability. Butler, 2004-20. Butler argues that the sufferings of others, even the ones you feel like you didn't cause directly, bring up larger questions about our ethical obligation. For Butler, it is precarity that makes the ethical obligation arise, as we can see that other animals, the earth, and other humans are endangered because of the environmental crisis. That's our sensibility of feeling others suffering, which we call compassion, since we too are all vulnerable, to various degrees, in intersecting environmental crises, with new predicaments of racial discrimination and gender inequality. Beyond and besides human affectivity of themselves, Ole's careful bird watching was insightfully shared in the section of Birds, Sensation and Touch. Ole 2020, 61-72. She places an example of avian affective behavior within her paradigm of the enigmatic space of the untouchable. As she says, quote, "None of this behavior, I argue, would have been possible had it not been for the effective embodied social practices that make up the world of meaning for avian life. At its center stands touching and being touched, and what enables it? The absent yet not impassive physical and metaphysical space of the untouchable." End quote. 76. Ole theorizes that skin provides us a glance into the depth of human affectivity, and as a biological and technological evolutionary interface, the skin, quote, "lives our age, future, trauma, vulnerability, and finitude." End quote. 54. Skin hasn't just been a result of evolution and species development, it is also the manifestation and creation of our own individualized spaces. Thus, the synthetic power of flesh extends to our skin. The skin exists both in the world and in itself, and touch is its medium for sensing differences in the earth, our environment. However, touch is always at risk with potential hazard and contamination, especially in the pandemic, and skin's intermingling with the world risks potential damage to the entire organism, if the intensities surpass the skin's ability to handle it. Ole writes, quote, "Touch allows the affective animal body to come to the fore in its most remarkable presence and absence, as allowing the world to be relatable to it, but only mediated and never direct." End quote. 61. However, it has become more and more difficult to touch the other under self-quarantine, so as to prevent the spread of the pandemic virus. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, we have been practicing no-touch, untactile existences, and no social or virtual contact, and growing distrust in external objects and others, including more than humans. The word phrase, social distancing, though having a technical sense in public health discourse, is not a very apt term to refer to the kind of careful physical distancing involved in slowing rates of viral transmission. However, the post-pandemic existence of human beings has become more and more socially distanced. We might stop using the term social distancing and start talking instead about physical distancing and social connections. Given Ole's argument, the skin is not passive. It is rather a middle voice phenomenon that regenerates and synthesizes connections between our past, present, and future. Is this synthesis between our internal and external plane a true representation of the middle voice? Is trust really the answer to the racialization and politicizing of skin? How can we institute trust on a cultural level when society is filled with so much distrust? The Korean concept of jong, and E-Co-Affectivity. In the last chapter of E-Co-Affectivity, Ole suggests a new us to go beyond the Anthropocene. She quotes Alfred North Whitehead, quote, "Life lurks in the interstices of each living cell." Whitehead 1985, 106, end quote. Ole 2020, 159. Ole is concerned with constructing a non-anthropocentric us by suggesting a new and different paradigm from human exceptionalisms. Quote, "Here lies the opportunity to reconstitute ourselves and our perceptions, to bring about new alliances, to break down barriers while constituting a new us, all while simultaneously keeping in mind questions of race, class, gender, and species, as much as bios writ large." End quote. 159. Nonetheless, this all-inclusive planetary solidarity is our physiological dilemma, given the principle of our ecosystem. As Whitehead declared, life is fundamentally robbery in terms of consuming patterns. Quote, "The societies which it destroys are its food. Whether or no it be for general good, life is robbery. It is at this point that with life morals become acute. The robber requires justification." End quote. Whitehead 1978, 105. The word robbery for life might be a harsh word, or a warning for every form of life, since everything is eating and being eaten, which is the circle of life. The conventional use of robbery indicates violence and exploitation of the other. The more complex the entity is, the greater the robbery from other entities, as human beings eat more diverse foods than any other animal. For Whitehead, an entirely living nexus requires its immediate environment. Thus, everyone becomes part of the environment of others. A hybrid prehension is the prehension by one subject of a conceptual prehension, or of an impure prehension, belonging to another subject. Could we human beings call ourselves environments of animals and trees, not the other way around? Could we recognize us as food of nature, or eventually returning to soil or becoming nature? Nature feeds us and vice versa. Unless human beings recognize mutual agencies with more than human others through the way of nature, the suggested new us only indicates human alliances. The category of we or us should be expanded to organismic communities of communities in this entire and extended planetary family, though this surely still remains uneasy, or maybe even impossible. Never quite all in all. However, we dare to construct a new us, a new Earth, and a new public / a new ecocracy, or Earth democracy. Lastly, I appreciate the brilliant title, Ole's E-Co-Affectivity, as referring to the love and interconnection of all in our cohabited Earth home, oikos. Since affectivity is, too much, associated with contemporary philosophical idiom, she finds a Greek root pathos, suffering, illness, and emotion, and combines it with oikos, home Earth, where affectivity takes place through her ethical lens with her sensitivity to ecological concerns. Ole 2020 4-5. I would like to introduce here a Korean term jong, slash, as a resonant term for eco-affectivity. Jong, emotions or feelings, is generally known as the most distinctively Korean experience of human emotionality. It is really difficult to translate the term jong in any direct sense to an English idiom. We can translate it as emotion, feeling, love, sentiment, passion, human nature, sympathy, heart, and so on in an inclusive sense, including all of the connotations of these terms. Furthermore, it can refer to more basic feelings, such as attachment, bonds, and affections. As the most complex web of entangled and sticky feelings, jong can be interpreted as any affective tone within a set of feelings and affections, grounded in a deep-seated love or attachment. But such a rendering is still insufficient to embrace the delicate, subtle, and deep feelings of jong that are formed and saturated from, and within all forms of ordinary relations in daily living. As love admits of many degrees and operates on various spectrums of affection, such as forgiveness, relationality, vulnerability, and solidarity, jong too embraces all these relational affections, but should not be conceived as being limited to any one of them. Specifically, jong is not just an abstract concept of love, but more like a relational embodiment of intimacy or familiarity rooted in compassion and solidarity. The effective route of this expansive and intensive emotion can proceed from namely solidarity via compassion, or compassion via solidarity. For Koreans, jong has long been commonly recognized and practiced as a more lasting, transformative, and powerful emotion than various forms of mere love. In Korean contexts, jong may well be a relational and interdependent embodiment of emotion with certain moral, psychological, or social dimensions. Jong needs to be actualized through eco-caring activities, as we have learned from extended Korean, familial experiences of sharing jong and salim, eco-caring/enlivening. If we do not limit the category of jong to only human communities, the sticky familial feelings of love can be translated well via Ole's neologism of eco-affectivity. True planetary solidarity might be possible, then if we practice our planetary love through communities of care, as a good us/we. We, with Ole, are hoping then that the positive aspects of jong and eco-affectivity continue to become a healing mechanism for destructive Earth communities and can realize a new Earth for all of us. Please refer to the printed text for references and to cite this article. Next article.
Article 5, Affectivity, Continuity, and Separation, by Miguel Jose Paley. Abstract. This commentary explores the issues of separation and continuity in Marjolein Ole's E-Co-Affectivity. I begin by providing a summary of what makes the book unique and its important achievements before moving on to a critical discussion of Ole's concept of temporality. There, I claim that an overemphasis on the continuity between an organic being and the material interfaces that constitute it might be responsible for essential confusions in the understanding of time. My commentary begins by using Bergson's philosophy to distinguish two common views on time, and then argues that in several instances, Ole's descriptions of temporality are in fact describing space rather than time. As Bergson shows us, affect and emotion must be understood as qualities of experience rather than quantitative forms of presence. I then conclude by arguing that eco-affectivity might benefit from further thinking about separation and auto-affectivity as essential features in the process of affectivity. Keywords: affectivity, Bergson, separation, duration, temporality, space. Over the past few decades, the notion of affectivity has garnered increasing attention from all corners of academic life. Today, theoretical engagement with affectivity and its conceptual possibilities can be seen in fields as varied as philosophy, neuroscience, feminism, psychoanalysis, film studies, and many more. The apparent centrality and conceptual possibilities inherent in the notion of affectivity have even spawned the standalone field known as affect theory. Within these varied fields, however, certain basic assumptions regarding the nature of affectivity can usually be found. Affectivity, for the most part, is understood as a physical and psychological event that marks an experiencing subject or community. In many cases, affectivity is further determined as a social phenomenon. one whose occurrence importantly marks subjects' social and political lives. Marjolein Olay's 2020 new work, E-Co-Affectivity, is an important contribution to the field, if only because of its entirely original approach. Eco-affectivity doesn't simply eschew focus on people like Spinoza and Deleuze, Spinoza 2020, Deleuze and Guattari 2008. It in fact takes the unusually radical step of considering affectivity through an analysis of material surfaces and what it calls their mediating ontogenetic possibilities. Far from being irrelevant, however, consideration of the work of Spinoza, Deleuze, and Guattari would strengthen the project. With this approach, Olay's investigation charts an entirely new way to think about affectivity. Affectivity is determined, without an excessive focus on its psychological interpretations and without a reliance on what Olay identifies as the two dominant lineages of affective interpretation, the phenomenological and the Spinoza/Deleuzian. Instead, Olay's book turns to the work of Aristotle and a variety of other less commonly used sources for these issues. Olay's book is further distinct in terms of her desired goals. The study of affectivity as it is found in various material interfaces leads to the development of what she calls provisional ontologies rather than a comprehensive theory of affectivity as such, Olay 2020-11. In this sense, her work is somewhat reminiscent of Gaston Bachelard's series of works on the elemental imagination, referred to, for instance, Bachelard 1999. Here I'm also thinking methodologically rather than thematically. Olay's approach and use of provisional ontologies, the way the book weaves in and out of various surfaces and themes, reminded me of Bachelard's approach to the elemental imagination. Neither posits a traditional comprehensive theory of affect or imagination, but rather approaches the theme from many angles and exemplifies it through a series of different but related investigations. With each chapter, the reader is presented with a new material interface and the various ways in which these constitute the emergence of a variety of organisms. Eco-affectivity presents the reader with a series of novel analyses which illustrate the multifaceted workings of affectivity throughout the natural world. In investigating the various modalities and possibilities of affectivity at life's material interfaces, Olay's work thus leads to some tremendous achievements. Among these are novel understandings of the radical continuity among living beings and the natural world, as well as deeply significant notions of co-constitution and the above-mentioned process of ontogenesis. In the end, all of these elements come together to illustrate deeply hopeful notions of community and trust. While this general methodological approach has tremendous rewards, it also risks certain drawbacks. Namely, in minimizing the essential role of separation in both subjectivity and the process leading up to it, Olay often seems to fall back on what Henri Bergson, 2001, another essential thinker of affectivity, would call a spatial understanding of time. As I will argue below, however, this seems to be more a contingency of historical interpretation than an essential flaw in Olay's approach. The insights necessary for a non-spatial understanding of temporality remain available to Olay without compromising her analysis through problematic introductions of transcendental or solipsistic subjects. As mentioned above, eco-affectivity is unique in its approach and its choice of textual sources. For Olay, the focus on material surfaces seeks to highlight the creative, ontogenetic possibilities of affect. Throughout her analyses, affectivity is seen to be an essential and localized process through which time, place, and being are first created. Further, because of the focus on different material surfaces rather than psychological states, Olay lays claim to a better appreciation of the uniqueness of every event of constitution. Quote, "The interfaces I investigate seek to offer a localized material place to engage affectivity, and simultaneously show how every interface is not simply an existing place or surface, but a place of ontogenesis, always emerging, creative, porous, and fluid," end quote. Olay 2022. Olay justifies this focus on material surfaces by appealing to the Aristotelian meaning of affect as pathos, suffering, emotion, which is much broader than that, quote, narrow, psychological interpretation of affect as passion, mood, feeling, and emotion, end quote, Olay 2027. This Aristotelian focus is also what ultimately sets eco-affectivity apart from affect theorists like Masumi, Clough, and Ahmed, 2010. Theorists whose work is more in line with the approach to affect of Deleuze and Spinoza. In the end, all these insights build to the idea of community understood as co-affective emergence, a community which is fundamentally prior to and constitutive of the individual subject. Put another way, Olay shows that subjectivity itself can only come as a result of processes of categorical contamination which are seen throughout the natural world. These relationships and contaminations are found at all levels of life, from the soil in which we bury our dead to more complicated organisms like plants, animals, human beings, and eventually communities as commonly understood. In the realm of plant life, continuity and contamination find expression through the linguistic category of the middle voice. So understood, plants are granted a dimension of affective depth that nowise relies on any robust notion of a centralized nuclear subject or agent. Olay 2020, 22-23. What the middle voice describes, rather, is a kind of open-ended process that is neither autonomous nor wholly dependent, a process which, although effective and passionate, quote, escapes ramification in terms of the division between agent-patient, inner-outer, or subject-object, end quote, Olay 2020-37. Boundaries are similarly blurred in animal affectivity with the use of Aristotle's notion of aesthesis, from the Greek aesthetikos, meaning related to sense experience. Here, identity and separation seem subordinated to an untouchable medium which first makes touch possible. Unlike in plant life, separation thus does arise with animal affectivity, but the status of this separation is somewhat unclear. Such is the strength of the theme of continuity. For Olay, the untouchable and enigmatic medium of touch means the animal, quote, cannot be identified with its boundaries, escapes narrow confinement to the active-passive division, and is indebted to alterity, end quote, Olay 2020-61. Similarly, quote, avian touch involves a restructuring of aesthesis through community, where the aesthesis of one individual is made possible and informed by the aesthesis of yet another individual, end quote, Olay 2020-76. Within this metaphysics of affective fluidity, community and co-constitution once again hold ontological priority over difference and identity. Thus, while the animal is nevertheless described as remaining also radically and absolutely separated, this separation seems to result from a prior form of contact, quote, in the imminent meeting ground of affectivity, a mediated space in which animal identity is born out of difference, end quote, Olay 2020-77. In the realm of human life, we once again find a blurring of boundaries between self and other, this time through the material mediums of the placenta and the skin. As Olay shows, the placenta must be understood as an active, autonomous third agent in the process of pregnancy. The changes and transformations it brings about in both the mother's biology as well as in the fetus allow us to see yet another form of co-affective emergence and ontogenesis. It is through the placenta that new lives, temporalities, individualities, and a new community is created. Affectivity is again a common no-place from which individuality is first born. Throughout the book, what the study of affectivity and material surfaces makes evident is the stunning priority that connection, continuity, and co-community have over the notion of individuality and separation. Nowhere is this more evident than in the chapter on human skin. There, Olay maintains that the incredible variety of microorganisms that live and transform the skin challenge the very idea of individuality. Quoting both scientists and philosophers, Olay concludes that our existence is fundamentally coextensive before it is individual. Olay 2020, 128-29. In the end, these material explorations on co-affective emergence build up to a meditation on the necessity for a new ethics and a sense of community that can, through an acknowledgement of our fundamental unity with the earth and one another, challenge the problematic ways of life that have led to forms of alienation, discrimination, and impending environmental disaster. Separation and temporality. This emphasis on continuity and material interfaces is motivated in part by the wish to overcome the shortcomings of modern philosophy, In particular, its emphasis on, quote, static and insular activity, autonomy, and disembodied freedom, end quote, Ole 2026. It is likewise an attempt to move beyond the remnants of these thoughts as they appear in phenomenology, especially its anthropocentrism and solipsism. Ole 2026, 125. Now, while the text does manage to avoid these problems, I fear an overemphasis on continuity over difference, of materiality over psychology, and of co-affection over auto-affection risks running into issues of its own. We see this especially in the text's understanding of temporality. To illustrate the issue here, we can briefly turn to Bergson's 2001 Philosophy of Time. As Bergson pointed out, we may speak of temporality in two senses, what he called homogeneous time, or the time of clocks, and what he called duration. Clock time describes that common understanding of temporality as a sequence of moments. In this sense, time would be like a line moving forward, and each moment in time would be a point or segment of that line. Moments are thus discrete, homogeneous, and sequential. Mathematical abstraction often speaks of moments as such: T1, T2, T3, etc. Now, while this is indeed a useful and sometimes necessary way to understand time, Bergson argues that clock time doesn't accurately describe lived experience. For psychological life, the moments of temporality are neither homogeneous nor discrete. To show this, Bergson often uses the simple example of what it is like to listen to a musical melody. Think of a common melody you might know. Now, Bergson asks, change the duration and pitch of one of the notes in the melody. What you will quickly notice is that it is not the single, changed note which is experienced differently. It is rather the quality of the melody as a whole that is changed. This is because the moments of duration are never discrete but melt into one another. Duration, as the very essence of psychological experience, can only be thought of as what Bergson calls a heterogeneous multiplicity, 121. Time is not a series of instants that follow one another. It is a fundamentally continuous process whose moments are always variable, never equal to one another, and never truly separated from the process itself. Bergson thus notes an important difference between time as it is experienced and time as it is measured. In breaking up time into discrete, homogeneous segments, clock time is shown to not be measuring time at all, but rather space. For it is space, and only space, that can be broken down into homogeneous segments and become quantified. Thus, while clock time deals with quantities 1 hour, 10 minutes, 3 days, etc., duration relates qualities. Ultimately, this is what affect is for Bergson. Affect is a qualitative experience that reflects the subject's feeling of itself in duration. Subjectivity is thus fundamentally different in kind from space in at least this way. This remains true even if we consider material reality itself to be in duration, as Bergson himself did. Psychological experience is, in essence, a unique felt quality that is importantly distinct from its body, environment, and community. As Bergson 121 argues, time is not space. Time is a quality, not a presence or a quantity. For Bergson, these distinctions are enormously consequential, for they lie at the root of many of the fundamental problems of philosophy. The question of determinism and human freedom, the relationship between mind and body, the nature of evolution, and even the very possibility of metaphysical knowledge hinge upon a proper understanding of time. When temporality is spatialized, confusion and distortion are not far behind. Temporality in E-Co-Affectivity. Is temporality problematically spatialized in E-Co-Affectivity? Ole, of course, doesn't intend it to be, but without a robust development of separation and subjectivity, descriptions of temporality do tend to describe simultaneities in space more than they do duration. We can see this in particular in Ole's discussion of human skin. In Chapter 4, Ole claims that, quote, skin also affords us new insights regarding the deeper temporal structure that underpins human lives. The skin lives our age, future, trauma, vulnerability, and finitude, but not merely mimetically so, my emphasis. On the skin, events are not simply stamped and inscribed as they occur, but they are put together, synthesized according to a deeper temporal order than that of mere chronology. End quote. Ole 2020, 109. What is this non-mimetic temporality of the skin? Ole describes it as a synthesis, a putting together or contraction of history, which abbreviates that history and is thus affected by it. This occurs as a quote, pre-reflexive, passive synthesis, end quote, which, according to Ole's reading of Deleuze, is, quote, temporal, in that it constitutes a living present of the body, end quote, 121. Ole extends this Deleuzian thought of the body as integral to the skin because, quote, our skin is also passively synthesized and incorporates all these different temporal directions, end quote, 121. Are the two uses of the word synthesize above equivalent? And do they both apply to duration? As Ole mentions in a footnote, the relevant Deleuzian synthesis here is the synthesis of memory, which answers the question, how can the past be contemporaneous with the present and also ground the present? Deleuze, who was a keen reader of Bergson and engaged with his thought throughout his life, surely has Bergson's 1991 Matter and Memory in mind here, for it was in that book that Bergson first formulated the question of how the past exists in the present and in the body. Deleuze, that is thinking a duration in some sense. Ole argues that these temporal syntheses exist in the skin's processes of healing and scar-making, and argues that the skin, quote, composes and contracts past experience in these deposits of memories, which ground our present life and provide it with coherence and meaning. Ole 2020, 122. In this way, the skin is the setting for, quote, a complex temporal interplay between the time of our species, our evolutionary time, the time of our biological and parental ancestors, epigenetic time, as well as our own time, end quote, 122 to 123. But are there not important differences in how the words memory and synthesis are used here? Usually, temporal syntheses describe a fundamental aspect of the qualitative experience of temporality, be that understood as Deleuze integration, Bergsonian duration, Heideggerian ecstasies, or even the Kantian form of inner sense, whereas the epidermal processes of scarring and the influence of genetic markers can only be temporal or synthesizing in a metaphorical sense. This is evident from Ole's own use of quotes in the phrase deposit of memories, 122, which is attributed to Serres's poetic language, 121. Going back to Bergson's thoughts on time and space, it becomes difficult to see how one might speak of scarring or epigenetics as anything other than spatial phenomena, simultaneities rather than qualities. There is of course no question that the skin changes in time, but simple endurance can accommodate Ole's claim that the skin, quote, lives our age, future, not merely mimetically, end quote, 109. Scarring and epigenetic traits describe physical processes, not qualities. One does, no doubt, experience one's scarring and the processes of one's skin, but these experiences as experiences are qualities of the subject in duration rather than the skin itself. It's hard to see here, even in the poetic language used to express the syntheses of the skin, anything other than simple chronology, presence, and spatial phenomena. The spatialization of time is most evident in Ole's discussion of Botox and Heideggerian temporality. For Heidegger, recognition of our finitude is an essential moment in the achievement of authenticity. This occurs when Dasein confronts its future resolutely and breaks free from its mindless absorption in the idle present. Similar to the Deleuzian moment described above, Ole transposes this Heideggerian structure of authentic temporality to the skin in order to argue against the use of Botox and other anti-wrinkle techniques. The thought here is that just as Dasein must embrace its finitude and future to reach authenticity, so using Botox or anti-wrinkle techniques risks bringing, quote, our skin time to a standstill and freeze us up, quite literally my emphasis, cutting us off from our past and future and identifying us with a generic, eternal present to which we are oppressively tied, 125. This passage might be interpreted in two ways, but in either case, it is again difficult to see how Botox and skin could possibly describe anything other than spatial phenomena. On the one hand, we may think that Ole means to describe a temporality of the skin itself. In this case, however, the application of the Heideggerian schema would not work, for it is important to remember that Dacian can be resolute and authentic only because Dacian is in its being concerned for its being. Such self-reflexivity, with its characteristic anxieties and projections, could only be applied to skin metaphorically, whereas ole means to speak literally. On the other hand, we might take the argument to mean that the use of Botox freezes time for us, i.e., makes us as Dacian inauthentic in a Heideggerian sense. This seems to be more in line with what the text is saying. In that case, however, the argument would also not fit, as it would reduce Heideggerian temporality to a metaphysics of presence, which is precisely what being and time is trying to avoid. In Bergson's language, this move would again substitute space for time. Now, while I believe these issues pose important difficulties for E-Co-Affectivity, it seems to me that they are neither fundamental nor unavoidable. By way of conclusion, I'd like to quickly argue that a greater emphasis on separation need not compromise the insights of continuity entirely, and that Ole's project need not risk anthropomorphism through a greater consideration of separation and auto-affectivity. Must separation be solipsistic? Ole's stated goal in this book is to, quote, investigate how time and place and beings emerge, end quote. Ole, 2020. As I tried to show, however, time often lapses into space in these descriptions. Ironically, Ole's efforts to avoid anthropocentrism led to possible anthropomorphisms, such as in speaking of the memory of the skin or the sacrifice of plants. While valid, then I believe concerns over anthropomorphism and solipsism need not require the exclusion of certain phenomenological insights that might importantly come to bear on the nature and experience of temporality. Ole, of course, is aware of this when saying that her goal is to sharpen and adjust the tools of phenomenology rather than abandon them. The issue then might be more about which tools are used and sharpened and which are abandoned. Ole's hesitation with the Heideggerian schema and its problematic emphasis on separation seem to me entirely justified. But I would argue these issues are more indicative of Heidegger's own idiosyncrasies than phenomenological necessities. In fact, Heidegger's strongest critics are perhaps phenomenologists themselves. In the thought of French phenomenologists like Levinas, Merleau-Ponty, and even in Henry, Levinas 2013, Merleau-Ponty 1967, 1968, Henry 2008, 1973, we find an important emphasis on affectivity as instituting both separation and temporality. Their emphasis on separation, however, never institutes a sovereign, fully autonomous subject of the Cartesian kind. One possible reason for this might be the preponderance of Bergsonian philosophy in France during the 20th century. Second-generation French phenomenology is thus uniquely sensitive to issues of temporality, separation, and affectivity in ways which might suit the program of E-Co-Affectivity. Ole is also aware of this, and herself mentions Levinas as providing tools to break through modern philosophy's shortcomings. On this note, I wonder what Ole might say about approaches similar to that of Levinas, which develop views on affectivity as the institution of separation. Can we think of separation and embodiment together, without spatializing temporality? Can co-affectivity be reconciled with auto-affection and the institution of separation? Does separation necessarily endanger a strong sense of ethical community? Ultimately, I suspect these concerns about temporality and separation pose no serious threats to the general and important project of E-Co-Affectivity. If anything, my goal here is to point out how their elucidation might flesh out potential misunderstandings and to further develop this project in productive directions with E-Co-Affectivity. Ole has opened exciting new paths for thinking about affect and its ethical and political importance. These new directions of thought, I believe, might benefit from further consideration on the essential role of separation for the experience of temporality. Please refer to the printed text for references and to cite this article. Next article.
Article 6. Replies to Grosser, O. and Paley, by Marjolein Ole. Abstract. My book seeks to carve out a new way to examine affectivity by using interdisciplinary methods for scholarship of affectivity and by focusing on specific, concrete material interfaces in plants, birds, placentas, human skin, and finally soil. In my response to Florian Grosser, J.A. Sophia O. and Miguel Jose Paley. I emphasize this focus on local material eco-affectivity because it explains in large part why I strategically 1. Have or have not used certain sources or ideas in Aristotle and Heidegger, and 2. How I see my new research developing and addressing some of the concerns of the respondents regarding the need to tend to the inequities of vulnerability. Moreover, I will try to address 3 questions regarding post-human agency, as well as 4 cross-cultural comparisons with the Chinese concept of wu-wei and the Korean concept of jong, emotions or feeling. I conclude 5 by addressing concerns regarding the meaning of temporality as it is lived on the skin. Keywords: affectivity, suffering, biology, ecology, phenomenology, new materialism, science, temporality, elements, loss, Aristotle, Heidegger, pathos, Dagonet, interface, plants, birds, placenta, skin, soil, ontogenesis, wu-wei jong. My book seeks to carve out a new way to examine affectivity by using interdisciplinary methods for doing scholarship of affectivity, and by focusing on specific, concrete material interfaces in plants, bird feathers, placentas, human skin, and finally soil. Accordingly, my book tries to think through the interfaces where life emerges. My model of affectivity is one of stratified layering following the logic of materiality, thereby moving us away from a thinking of affectivity in terms of intentionality or human emotion, focusing on affectivity beyond the agent-patient opposition, towards a thinking of post-human communities, and on the way towards some prescriptive gestures. In the following, I will emphasize this focus on local material eco-affectivity because it explains in large part why I strategically 1. Have or have not used certain sources or ideas in Aristotle and Heidegger, and 2. How I see my new research developing and addressing some of the concerns of the respondents regarding the need to tend to the inequities of vulnerability. Moreover, I will try to address 3 questions regarding post-human agency, as well as 4 cross-cultural comparisons with the Chinese concept of wu-wei and the Korean concept of jong. I conclude 5 by addressing concerns regarding the meaning of temporality as it is lived on the skin, using or omitting certain sources in Aristotle and Heidegger. The early Heidegger as an important source for eco-affectivity. As Florian Grosser articulates, we might find helpful pathic moments in the later Heidegger to clarify potential human contributions to realizing new e-communities, and specifically, quote, more productive insights for a reconception of both subjectivity and intersubjectivity, end quote, Grosser 2025. This issue 8. Grosser locates such insights predominantly in concepts such as gestic, quote, ascending that addresses and elicits answers, and ding, quote, as that by which mortals are bedingt, bethinged, or conditioned, end quote, which not only work in, quote, opening up and displacing individual Dacian, as well as being with, end quote, but, quote, stress their pathic background, emergence, and constitution, and therefore transport a more unequivocal recognition of what might be designated as extrasubjectivity, end quote. 8. I do indeed see advantages in turning to the later Heidegger, and specifically in thinking of the broader community, of considering a people and an epoch being affected, rather than Heidegger's 1962 earlier focus on singular Dacian as thematized in being and time. In this regard, the later Heidegger's account of attunements that span an era and a people, and destine them to a certain way of disclosing the world, are productive and foreshadow the current interest in affect studies that span body, culture, technology, and power. Hart 2007-9. I also see a possible fruitful way to think through the later Heidegger's account of releasement, Gelassenheit, which thematizes releasement toward things, and is a meditative comportment that says both yes and no towards things, as a particular comportment. Heidegger 1995, 54-55. A similar way of thinking of affectivity in Heidegger can be found in his Country Path Conversations, where he addresses the need to go beyond willing, Heidegger 2010-70, and he is searching for a higher state of being affected, one which lies, quote, beyond the distinction between activity and passivity, end quote, Heidegger 2010-70. There, he encourages us to go on the path towards waiting, Heidegger 2010-76, which is the key toward releasement, Heidegger 2010-80. What these meditations on releasement show is that a new thematization of affectivity, beyond the usual paths of active and passive, is worthwhile and can overcome stifling categories that simply conceive human beings in the world as thinking, willing beings. Rather, concepts such as releasement open us up to see ourselves as engaged and immersed within phenomena that escape thinking and willing. This could indeed allow us to think of affectivity as emerging in broader eco-constellations. Despite these advantages that this conceptual turn toward attunements and Gelassenheit may provide in the later Heidegger, there are important disadvantages to using the later Heidegger, and these disadvantages are particularly apparent once put in contrast with the advantages of using the early Heidegger. First, readings of the later Heidegger have already saturated contemporary scholarship, e.g., in terms of post-structuralism, and have already been widely critiqued, hence dampening the need to address these topics. Secondly, to find traction in notions of temporality, the early Heidegger, and his account of the various ways of temporalizing, remains key for my understanding of the temporality of interfaces, particularly in the chapter 1 devote to skin. Specifically, for my sense of rethinking the famous Heideggerian moment of vision, in terms of a communal sense, it is helpful to use and critique the early Heidegger, precisely to clarify my new turn toward seeing temporality in a more communal key. Thirdly, the later Heidegger has a mystical tone to his thinking, which is not in line with my own thinking of concrete material interfaces in eco-affectivity. Thus, in step with the concrete reality that I seek to engage in eco-affectivity, being and times turn to the concrete reality within which Dacian operates seems to open up more helpful venues. Fourthly, and most importantly, it has been the early Heidegger whose reading of pathos, suffering, feeling, passion, illness, and qualitative change, in Aristotle provided such a constructive sense to grasping the plurality of meanings of this term, and thereby offered an important impetus to Heidegger's own thinking on affect, being, and becoming, Ole 2012a. For those four reasons, the early Heidegger has been more fundamental and relevant to eco-affectivity. A strategic use of Aristotle to disentangle human affectivity, Grosser suggests using Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics as quote, "It sheds light on the temporality of what Ole, with Jacques Rancière, see Ole 2020, 159, calls a revolution of the senses, rather than resulting from a sudden turnaround, modified beliefs, attitudes, and comportments, such as required for the new enlarged consensus Ole appeals to, can only be brought about through a steady progression from mimetic to internalized praxeus, actions, and subsequently, to a reliable hexis, stable disposition or habitus, or ethos character moral character, that is transmitted in widening communal circles." End quote. Grosser 2025, this issue 9. I agree with Grosser about the importance of Aristotle's account of dispositions, hexius. In fact, I have written about the emergence of passive dispositions from Aristotle's perspective, Ole 2012b, noting that it is important not only to think about how active dispositions come about, i.e., dispositions that turn around so-called actions, but also dispositions related to that, and how we are affected, for instance, that and how we feel fear. However, while I am distinctly interested in further thinking about passive dispositions in Aristotle, I also thought that appealing to Aristotle's notion of passive dispositions for eco-affectivity would have distinct disadvantages. My reasoning is that Aristotle's account of dispositions is focused on the discrete person who experiences those effects and related dispositions, while my account of affectivity, rather than building out from the individual to the wider culture, seeks to find a foothold in the material in between, the interface. Affects are thus implied, and dispositions as well, but I tried to access them through the material interfaces that produce them. To return to the example of the birth of our daughter, which I describe in a personal vignette in Chapter 4 on skin, it is naturally the case that emotions were felt. However, the vignette puts emphasis on the skin, and on how the formerly pregnant skin itself was left empty after birth, 108. Simultaneously, I highlight how in having skin-to-skin contact, there was an opportunity for a new spatial and temporal reconfiguration. The focus here is on the materiality of the interface that generates human emotions, but is also much more than that. Beyond extending from oneself to the environment, the interface itself creates the emergence of beings and environment. It is a task for a different book to focus on human emotion. Here the strategy is to make it part of the account, but not to emphasize it or draw particular attention to it, so as to allow the matter itself, that is eco-affectivity, to come to the fore. Secondly, as my account unpacks the various strata of affectivity, in plants, bird feathers, placentas, human skin, and finally soil, I am seeking to avoid focus on human affects. I think that the need to specifically define human emotion or individual dispositions would have distracted from the effort to emphasize the broader, stratified powers of affectivity. Thus, Grosser's suggestions to analyze individual human emotion and the consequent focus of reaching a personal mean would, in my view, have inserted too much of an anthropocentric and individualized lens, which, in a work devoted to the materiality of both human and non-human interfaces, would have distracted from the main focus. The need to address the inequity of vulnerabilities. Florian Grosser and J.A. Sophia both addressed the need to reflect on the notion of how vulnerabilities associated with affectivity are unequally distributed. Speaks of the, quote, sufferings of black and brown bodies that are closely related to the phenomena of environmental racism, end quote. 2025, this issue 19. Referencing the dehumanization of Asian women during COVID, asks, quote, could we think of affect theory in relation to these intersectional sufferings and pains, along with interspecies interconnectedness? 19. Grosser also points to the need to think through the inequity of vulnerability, stating eloquently and precisely, against the assumption of pathos as an equalizing phenomenon that seems to underlie Ole's account, it is important to recognize that social-political status and positionality essentially determine by what and to what degree individuals, groups, or on a global level, societies are affected. This differential distribution of being affected and vulnerable, and conversely of capacities for self-protection, although often veiled behind ideological slogans like, "We're in this together," has become abundantly clear during the ongoing pandemic. It is also playing out under conditions of climate change, where it manifests itself in vastly differing degrees of exposure to, e.g., rising seawater levels or temperatures, and their effects on, broadly speaking, life prospects. It is therefore critical to differentiate along the lines of race, gender, class, and age between strong, and weak, affectivity, between resulting unevenly scaled strong, or weak, communal bonds, and between the non-uniform responses given in concrete instances of we-building. Grosser 2025, this issue 10. Florian Grosser and J.A. Sophia raise a crucial point, that an account of eco-affectivity needs to take into consideration the uneven effects in which some bodies, more than others, are negatively affected by that which happens to them. I am in full agreement that any account of affectivity needs to do so with precision and with attention to the specific details of the affective matter that it studies. I would argue that, in many ways, my book Eco-Affectivity precisely, 1. does such work, 2. prepares such work for others to do, or 3. continues this work in the form of my new book manuscript Beyond Elemental Loss, 2025. In the first place, 1a, an example of my turn to how certain bodies are more negatively affected than others can be found in the book's first chapter, where I argue that certain native plant species, more than other invasive plant species, seem to suffer from anthropogenic climate change and industrialization. Ole 2020-46. While this is not the central focus of the first chapter, the first chapter enables this viewpoint of the inequity of plant affectivity, precisely by turning to the concrete lives of plants and their co-emergence in polyphonic communal places and temporalities. Additionally, 1b, and this is a broader point, my focus on the concrete embodied lives of more than human existence, e.g., plants, birds, soil, or forgotten or understudied organs, such as the placenta or human skin, seeks to offer a correction to a philosophical discourse that prioritizes human rational life. Thus, while I am in agreement that we need to pay attention to the inequity of suffering, my research in eco-affectivity does precisely that, but sidelines purposefully the focus on human suffering, to index the importance of learning from more than human forms of affectivity. Thus, similar to Irigaray, 2001, call for restoring justice to forgotten elements such as air, in Heidegger, or earth in Nietzsche. My act of paying attention to forgotten living interfaces seeks to correct a philosophical idiom steeped in anthropocentrism and forgetful of the shared ecological constellations of which we are part. Thirdly, 1c. I argue that the simple act of paying attention to describing and analyzing the relational affectivity in plants, birds, placentas, skin, and soil offers the very beginnings for an ethics of responsivity. Following Gabriel Marcel's account of the importance of testimony for ethics, Marcel 1967, 102, the act of offering philosophical testimony to the material interface is in itself, in my view, a valuable and ethical beginning, and offers ample opportunities to consequently think through notions of human responsiveness. 2. In terms of preparing the work that is so necessary to rethink the inequity of suffering, E-Co-Affectivity precisely enables and prepares, through its very setup, the question of the inequity of suffering. In the first place, 2a, the research that is done in E-Co-Affectivity is, methodologically, placed at the very intersection of material-biological, cultural-political, and semantic questions. This means that notions of inequity can acquire both nuance and depth based on this approach. Secondly, 2b, I show exactly how this may be prepared, such as in the chapter on skin. In that chapter, I use Aristotle against Aristotle's own theory, namely that shame is only a temporary reaction, to argue instead that shame can be dispositionally imposed upon some skins more than others. By turning Aristotle's theory against himself, I allow for a historical redirection of the philosophical discourse, and argue that we would do well to look at skin and shame not just through the notion of temporary effect, but through the lens of affective dispositions that certain bodies are placed into, informed and realized through social economic structures with a long historical genealogy. Thirdly, 2c. This means that E-Co-Affectivity could open up many more productive trajectories, which others could take on, but which in themselves lie outside the purview of my project. For instance, one may think through how, in various cultures and in different registers of race, class, and gender, the meaning of soil may differ, and what this means for the kinds of human inequities produced. Thus, rather than closing off those options to think through human affectivity and the inequity of suffering, my book explicitly refers to and rejects pernicious epidermal death zones, 133, associated with race, class, and gender, and thus opens up to these important dimensions that others may pursue in their research. 3. Beyond E-Co-Affectivity. The research in my new book manuscript Beyond Elemental Loss reflects thematically on the unevenness of human suffering and loss, one specifically as caused and brought to light by the current ecological crisis. As the COVID-19 crisis of the past years has illuminated, we need to reach beyond what is immediately visible or present to rethink the accumulated vulnerabilities that have been built, slowly and incrementally, over time, and that have come to underpin our life worlds. In order to grasp the accumulated weight of histories underpinning loss in times of climate change, I have been drawn to theorists such as Lauren Berlant, 2007, and Peter Sloterdijk, 2016, to examine these so-called atmospheric conditions, and I have been rendering these conditions in terms of elemental constellations. As I redefine the elements of water, fire, air, and earth, with historical precursors in the Presocratics, I radicalize the elemental as a primary condition for the world's appearance and meaning. However, instead of static, atemporal, and purely natural, I view the elemental as a space of flux and constant interaction with our social-political institutions. Under the pressures undergirding the Anthropocene, incremental changes have had major effects across various scales, both within the realm of the material causal and the logical semantic. I argue that to investigate this site of incremental change, by way of the elemental allows for focus both on the micro level, e.g., as particles of water, and on the macro level, e.g., as larger global forces that change our interface with the sea, i.e. seascape. Thus, the research that began with E-Co-Affectivity in its pull towards the minute and the material directness of interfaces has found another direction and home in beyond elemental loss, in seeking to investigate the broader ontological-ecological, historical-cultural interface that I call the elemental. This means that, for instance, rather than focusing on the liminal in-between space between the feathers that co-create the sensitivity of the avian body, as I did in E-Co-Affectivity, I focus in Beyond Elemental Loss on the mediated, liminal space of our relationship to the seashores that has undergone significant historical changes, enabling and foreclosing opportunities for our coexistence with the ocean and our sense of being at home. Said differently, where E-Co-Affectivity centered on the depth of the minute, concrete material interface, Beyond Elemental Loss traces historical, incremental changes within the broader, ecological social, elemental interfaces of water, fire, air, and earth that have left in their wake a sense of loss. 2. In its examinations of affectivity, loss, and grief, Beyond Elemental Loss offers a more prescriptive lens than E-Co-Affectivity did. This does not undermine the validity of E-Co-Affectivity. It shows that questions of ethics that emerge from E-Co-Affectivity have continued in a different shape and matter. While E-Co-Affectivity only turned to the prescriptive in its last chapter, Beyond Elemental Loss offers a more sustained account of ethical and political issues in investigating the broader questions of engagement that rule our relationship and behavioral interplay with the elemental. Thus, where E-Co-Affectivity showed biological adaptation at the level of the co-emergent interface, for instance of the bird feather, Beyond Elemental Loss seeks to investigate cultural historical adaptation, or the lack thereof, at the macro level. Thus, where E-Co-Affectivity asked, in what sense can avian bodies be adapted to trauma? Beyond Elemental Loss asks, in what sense can certain systematic political insurance systems be maladapted to fire risk or flooding? And in what way can we prescriptively rethink the locus of adaptation and change? Thus, as this overview shows, my thinking on affectivity has been evolving along the lines of thinking through the inequity of suffering. But this thinking does not supersede the main lines of E-Co-Affectivity. Rather, it has been extending those lines in ever new directions, speaking more and more to the issue of ecological social crises that have transformed our lives. The focus on pathesis versus poiesis and the role of post-human agency. The question of agency is indeed the question of poiesis, making, shaping, more generally, and the interface, I argue, is the broader launching place for examining this issue, as it enables the co-generation of material causal and social cultural aspects of living beings. E-Co-Affectivity ends for a specific reason on tending to the soil, with the gesture of the post-human brought forth, both by the metaphor and the ontology of the soil. This interface is the space of interaction. We may engage with it, and be changed through it with our interaction. For this reason, I turn the notion of the human into one of the post-human, yet to be imagined. Similar to Haraway's account of wanting to envision us through the Thylacine as different chthonic, tentacular beings. Haraway 2016-2. The task here is to stretch the imagination and perform the act the soil chapter imagines. Attentiveness to the material, messy interface. And more specifically, I mean the term interface here as entailing various different ontologically, biologically, and socially tiered levels. As I indicate in the soil chapter, I am curious what role a post-human affectivity might look like, and in what way it may be produced by, and interact with the world around it. This means that when Grosser speaks of a primarily human task that we have to engage in, I think it is necessary to build in a moment of pause and modification. I want to outline that the kind of being I want to see produced through an act of attentiveness being born out of the soil is not a human, but a post-human being who takes responsibility and who does not rule and master the earth in the way the Cartesian subject has done. By articulating the interface across species and scales, and kinds of affectivity, culminating in soil, which folds into those layers, we have to rethink what community means, which allows for the opening up of the space within which political decisions are produced. Within the context of the Anthropocene, I am trying to articulate that it is not yet so clear what decisions and actions have to be undertaken, but that we would do well to think through the broader material, scientific, and semiotics of the interface we are immersed in. The act of paying attention to this is the first step, which, as I articulated earlier, is already an ethical step. Cross-cultural comparisons to Wu Wei and Zhang O provides a careful consideration of cross-cultural connections, such as between the middle voice in plants and the Chinese concept of Wu Wei. Wu Wei literally means not Wu, trying way, or not Wu, acting with effort or deliberation way. In a more general way, this means a kind of effortless, spontaneous, in the zone skillful action. In uncovering the meaning of Wu Wei as connected to nature, O cites the Tao Te Ching, pointing at the meaning of Wu Wei as, quote, yielding, letting nature do what nature does. O 2025, this issue 17. This offers helpful comparative insights, possibly allowing convergence with Aristotle's ideas on physis, nature, as having its own goals and purposes. However, what is different here in comparison to Aristotle is the idea of letting and yielding. With my chapter on plants, I have tried to show mostly the internal logic of a plant, and how through the middle voice we might get closer to understanding a plant's organization and way of becoming. We may speculate what the ethical repercussions of this are as follows. Since plants are part of our biosphere, they are part of our diet, of our gardens, of our way of life. Yielding is interesting, but possibly too vague to give us an ethical direction. Here, more than anything, I first plead for attention to the interface, and to grasp how certain plants more than others have been affected by our actions in the last few centuries. In other words, we may need to yield more to some, e.g. indigenous species, than to others, e.g. invasive species, thinking through the ecology of which plants are a part. Since the vulnerabilities are not shared across plants, but are uneven, the question of respect for plants, for their resilience and adaptivity, is also at the same the question of rethinking our alliances. Perhaps, of course, the concept of Wu Wei may include such an option for discernment, since it is not just any effortlessness that is practiced, but as others have argued, a skillful effortlessness, Slingerland 2003. If that is the case, then Wu Wei may offer a possible complementary ethical practice to perceiving plants and their community on the way to a more fruitful cohabitation. In this regard, Baptiste Morizot's claims in Rekindling Life speak to the power of skillful human retreat, which aim to, quote, leave, that is restore, wildlife to itself, end quote. 2022-11, by setting boundaries upon human intrusion and letting plants, for instance in the form of a forest, regrow. Quote, letting an ecosystem express its powers, use its capacity to regenerate itself after it has been transformed by humans, end quote. 11. However, we still need to caution against a form of skillful effortlessness that is Wu Wei-like, but that includes habituated patterns that are problematic, given immoral intentions or insensitivities towards relevant distinctions on the way toward living together. Instead, Skin points the way toward a fluid, effective co-emergence of human sapient affectivity. Focusing upon skin allows us to witness a place for transformation. Quote, one that allows both inner and outer, self and world, to emerge and respond to each other through its protective yet vulnerable mediation, end quote. Olay 2020-113. It is crucial to point out this focus on co-emergent sapient affectivity since this undermines, from the very beginning, Paley's assertion that my account of temporality as lived on the skin follows the contours of clock time, or as worded by Paley, provides, quote, descriptions of temporality that are in fact describing space rather than time, end quote. Paley 2025, this issue 26. Moreover, Paley claims that, with respect to my account of events occurring on the skin, quote, one does, no doubt, experience one's scarring and the processes of one's skin, but these experiences as experiences are qualities of the subject in duration rather than the skin itself, end quote. Paley 2025, this issue 27. My rebuttal consists in arguing that Paley's statements misunderstand my project, largely based on their own reinsertion of the problematic dichotomy of subject versus object, translated here in terms of so-called inner subjectivity, qualities of the subject, versus a so-called outer objectivity, the skin itself. By grasping lived time merely as inner consciousness and duration, and skin merely as outer physical clock time, or as spatialized time, Paley repeats the problematic dualistic statements of Bergson, who thinks that scientific accounts can only, quote, forecast and measure, Now we cannot forecast physical phenomena, except on condition that we assume that they do not endure as we do. And on the other hand, the only thing we are able to measure is space, end quote. Bergson 1959. 230. Emphasis. Added. As this quote shows, Bergson operates with a stark dichotomy that I seek to reject in that I see skin not as outer nor as inner. So, rather than my own account being subject to accusations of viewing time in terms of spatialized temporality, as Paley argues, I find that Paley's views on the workings of the skin return us to problematic subject-object dichotomies that I seek to reject. To add on to this, in engaging the materiality of the interface that is skin, I seek to use scientific and evolutionary insights on skin as they actually inform us about human sapient sentient affectivity. These scientific insights do not just return us to quantum, but inform the qualities of living embodiment. 3. This implies that I reject notions that see the true temporality as lived through inner conscious duration. Rather, skin has an inner qualified logic, offering choices we live daily. Referee Acknowledgements. The Journal of Philosophy of Emotion would like to extend a sincere appreciation to those scholars who served as referees for the JPE: Paul Custer, Jeffrey Dirksenz, Greg Minisolet, Brian Onishi, and John Protavi. Thank you for your valuable contribution. The editors and authors appreciated your insightful and constructive feedback. This journal cannot fulfill its mission without the voluntary support of scholars like you, and we hope you will continue to work with us in our future endeavors. Recent publications announcement: Jacqueline Bellin, Friedrich Eisel, Bruno Granch, Sebastian Narwagener, and Ricardo Woolencourt. 2022. Theory and Practice of Sociosensitive and Socioactive Systems. Springer, Luke Brunning. 2024. Romantic Agency, Loving Well in Modern Life. Polity, Robert R. Cluis. 2023. The Origins of Consesthetics. Cambridge University Press. Ronald D'Souza. 2025. Why It's Okay to Be Amoral. Routledge, Rami Gabriel. 2023. A Suspicious Science. Oxford University Press. Matthew C. Haug. 2025. Rethinking Self-Control. Routledge, Bradley J. Irish. 2025. The Universality of Emotion. Cambridge University Press. Bertram Mell and Philip Robbins, eds 2025. Cambridge Handbook of Moral Psychology. Cambridge University Press. Azadeh Thairizarjanji, Jeffrey Dirksenz, Michael Funk Deckard and Andres Bruzoni, eds 2023. Le Mal et la Symbolique, Recours Lecteur de Freud. De Gruyter, CFP Announcements. The JP is happy to announce a call for commentaries on Jonathan Flowers's Mono no Aware and Gender as Effect in Japanese Aesthetics and American Pragmatism. Commentaries and CVs are due February 28, 2025, and notifications will be sent out by March 28, 2025. The JPE is also happy to announce a second CFP on Thomas Nail's The Philosophy of Movement. An introduction. Commentaries and CVs are due June 30, 2025. Notification will be given by July 15, 2025. The JP is also happy to announce our third CFP on Brian Hisao Onishi's Weird Wonder in Merleau-Ponty, Object-Oriented Ontology, and New Materialism. A completed APA-affiliated group session and JPE Book Symposium interest form and CV are due June 30, 2025. Notification will be given by July 15, 2025. Please refer to the CFP on the JPE website for further details. This marks the end of this podcast edition of the Journal of Philosophy of Emotion, 2025, Volume 6, Issue 2. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this podcast, and please join us again for the podcast edition of our next issue.